Assalamualaikum and a warm welcome to all our attendees for Islam and Liberty Network's Edraak webinar series. My name is Nur Netusha Nusaibah, and it is my honor to serve as your MC for today's event. Tonight, or whichever part of the world you're listening from, today, we gather virtually to explore and debate the critical issues surrounding liberal democracy and its discontents. Before we dive into our discussions, we would like to extend a special welcome to our esteemed speakers and moderator, Professor Emeritus Haji Dr. Shad Salim Faruqi from the University of Malaya, Malaysia, a renowned scholar in constitutional law with a wealth of knowledge and experience. Professor Dr. Bijan Sahin from Hacettepe University, Turkey, whose expertise in political science and democracy will provide invaluable insights into our topic. And moderating our session tonight, we have Dr. Ali Salman, the CEO of Islam and Liberty Network, whose leadership and commitment to advancing liberty and democracy in Muslim societies is truly inspiring. Thank you all for being here today. Our theme for tonight's webinar, Liberal Democracy and its Discontents, addresses a topic of immense relevance and urgency. Democracy is often lauded for its role in promoting good governance, human rights, and accountability, empowering citizens to change their governments through peaceful means. However, we must also confront the reality that democracies can sometimes falter, becoming plutocracies, forgive my pronunciation, or being captured by the deep state. Additionally, democracies have been known to initiate colonial conquests, wars of aggression, and even crimes of humanity. So we must ask ourselves, is liberal democracy on the rise? Or is it on the path of decline, especially within the context of Muslim societies? And if liberal democracy is indeed faltering, what alternatives do we have? Tonight, we will delve into these pressing questions, examining the difficulties and complexities in balancing political power and democratic governance. Our speakers will reflect on the current state of liberal democracy in Muslim societies, offering their nuanced perspectives and thought-provoking insights. Our webinar today will unfold as follows. First, we will begin with some remarks from Dr. Ali Salman, the CEO of Islam and Liberty Network. Second, we will then listen to presentations from our distinguished speakers who will share their expertise on the subject. Thirdly, and finally, following the presentations, we will have a moderated discussion led by Dr. Ali Salman, which will include a Q&A session where you, our audience, can engage directly with our speakers. We encourage you to actively participate and share your thoughts and questions throughout the session. Your engagement is vital as we navigate these critical issues together. So, without further ado, let us commence our exploration of liberal democracy and its discontents. I now hand over the floor to Dr. Ali Salman, who will deliver his opening remarks to officially commence tonight's session. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Ali.
Thank you so much, Noor, and thank you again, Professor Shad and Professor Bijan, for joining the first edition of Island Edraak webinars. This is a new project that we are embarking with the support from the Atlas Network, and basic aim of this project is in remaining consistent with the goal of Islam and Liberty Network to promote the ideas of liberal democracy, but also to better understand this institution both locally and globally. As you would have seen from our earlier interactions or earlier publications, we support the idea of political freedom, economic freedom, and religious freedom, focusing on Muslim societies and beyond. We also believe that these ideas are consistent with our understanding of Islam and compatible with the global value system. However, as the title of this webinar already indicates, there are dissatisfaction, it has its own share of discontents, and the fruits and the manifestations of liberal democracy are not equal across the world, and the experiences vary greatly. Experiences vary within the country, over time, and across the regions also. So we thought that to begin this important project of Edraak, which is basically means to understand, we will begin with this important topic, and we're very fortunate to have our fellows, island fellows from Turkey and from Malaysia, to inaugurate the discussion on the foundation of our governance system. Both Malaysia and Turkey, I would like to add, are they have their own share of struggle alongside of the democracy, but broadly defined, they are considered model countries in many sense, in many perspective. And when you look at the OIC member countries, 56 or 57 countries, I think large Muslim population also look at the models which Turkey and Malaysia have adopted with their own historical perspective. So I think we would like to explore it further, and we would also engage more broadly about the liberal democracy as an institution and its challenges in today's contemporary world. So with these opening remarks, I hope that we look forward for a very fruitful discussion, and I will request Professor Bijan Shaheen to start the webinar by his presentation. This will be assisted by Noor, so maybe I hand over back to you, Noor, to manage the slides.
Thank you for your remarks, Dr. Ali. We will now begin to listen to the presentations by our speakers tonight. It is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker for this evening, or whichever time zone you are in, Professor Bijan Shaheen. Professor Shaheen is a distinguished scholar in the field of political science, currently serving as a professor in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at 𝐻𝐻𝐾 University in Ankara, Turkey. He is also the former president of the Freedom Research Association, an organization dedicated to promoting the values of freedom and democracy. Professor Shaheen earned his PhD from the University of Maryland, College Park in 2003. His research encompasses a wide range of topics, including classical liberal and libertarian philosophy, the intricate relationship between liberal democracy and Islam, and the dynamic interplay between state and civil society in Turkey. His deep understanding of the subject positions him as an invaluable voice in today's discussion on liberal democracy and its discontents. So I'm about to share the slide, then we can begin.
Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to extend my gratitude to Dr. Ali and Noor Netusha for inviting me to be a speaker in this conference, in this inaugural conference of Edraak series. Today, the title of my presentation is Liberalism, Democracy, Rule of Law, and Turkish Experience. And I will start with liberalism, what liberalism is, and how it approaches democracy and the issues of rule of law. And then I will proceed to talk about Turkish experience with respect to rule of law and democracy. Next slide, please. Liberalism is an ideology that places individual as opposed to collectivities at its center. Individualism is one of the main pillars of liberalism. Liberalism is morally, ontologically, and methodologically individualist. What does it mean to be morally individualist? Moral individualism means that individuals' goals are valuable in and of itself. They are not valuable because they serve the interests of another entity, such as nation, such as class or ummah, but they are valuable because they are chosen by the individual in question. And liberalism is ontologically also individualist. This means that the real entity is individual. The living organism is individual. Entities such as nation or society are as abstractions. Finally, liberalism is methodologically individualist, meaning that when we try to understand the social events, we should focus on the motives and actions of the individuals. It is individual who acts rather than society or class. So to understand social phenomena, we should focus on individuals. Next, please. According to liberals, individuals have moral rights. One of the most fundamental of those rights is liberty. For liberals, liberty means that individuals should be left alone in designing their lives and pursuing their projects, which do not harm other individuals' lives and liberties. Isaiah Berlin denounced this as negative liberty. Liberals tend to believe that only in an environment of liberty, individuals have a chance to access to happiness. In an environment of liberty, individuals design their lives, pursue their life projects, and hopefully achieve happiness at the end of this process. Next slide, please. For liberals, individuals are also social creatures. We live in societies. We do not live on our own. We are not isolated creatures. Thus, we have common collective needs, such as public infrastructure, justice, and security. And we need to make decisions about these common needs, collective needs. These decisions can be made either through an individual or a minority in an authoritarian fashion, or by all the people in a democratic fashion. Liberals prefer the democratic decision-making over the authoritarian one. Next slide. For liberals, democracy is a collective decision-making mechanism. It works on the basis of the principle of majority. In a democracy, sovereignty lies in the hands of the people. However, this sovereignty is used in a limited sphere. The borders of this limited sphere are determined by individual rights. The liberals are worried about the tyranny of majority. They think that the actions that are tyrannical, done by an individual or an autocrat, are not legitimated when they are carried out by a majority. They can be also quite tyrannical. So we need to limit the democracy as well. For liberals, thus, democracy must be a limited democracy. In other words, it must be a liberal democracy. Next slide, please. One of the mechanisms of limiting democracy in the majorities is the principle of rule of law. There is an inseparable relation between the rule of law and liberal democracy in this respect. And independence and the impartiality of the judiciary is the backbone of the principle of rule of law. If there is no independent and impartial judiciary in a country, we cannot talk about the existence of the rule of law. Rule of law means a rule not on the basis of arbitrary decisions of rulers, but a rule based on the law. The main motive behind rule of law is to protect fundamental human rights. This is, in fact, a recent phenomenon. Throughout history, individual rights have not been protected by the states. Even in democracies, for example, in ancient Athens, individual rights were open to aggression by the majorities. There is a distinction made by Fukuyama with respect to rule by law and rule of law. Rule by law basically means that commands of the rulers are dominant in a system. That is, rather than rule by rule of law, the commands of the ruler is in charge. But in the case of rule of law, a country or a people is subject to rule of law, and not only the ordinary citizens, but also the rulers are under the rule of law, under the law. This is the rule of law. Next slide, please. Thus, liberal or constitutional democracies are based on rule of law. Democracies that are not based on rule of law are variously called illiberal democracies, delegative democracies, or competitive authoritarianism. We can move on to the next slide. Next slide, please. Yes. Now let's turn to rule of law in Turkey. Rule of law in Turkey has never been strong. And the reason for weakness of the rule of law in Turkey can be traced back to the origins of the Republic. During the foundation of the Republic, the founding leaders wanted to create a homogeneous, secular, and Turkish nation state. They based their project on an ideology, official ideology called Kemalism, named after the founder of the Republic, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. The basic tenets of this ideology of Kemalism are Turkish nationalism and secularism. Basically, through Turkish nationalism, the founding leaders wanted to create a homogeneous society. As a result, there was population exchanges, for example, between Greece and Turkey. Turks were sent from Greece to Turkey, and Greeks were sent back to Greece. And Kurds, which is a big minority in Turkey today, which is around 20% of the whole population, are forced to assimilate into Turkish identity. And in the secularism respect, the courts, such as Sharia courts, were shut down, and religious schools, such as madrasas, were shut down, and they were replaced by secular courts and secular schools. And all the state institutions were given the role of protecting this ideology and creating this homogeneous secular Turkish nation state. And judiciary was not an exception to that. Thus, judiciary, from the beginning of the Republic, had the role of protecting Turkish secular nation state. And this was a system called tutelage system. Along with military bureaucracy, Turkish judiciary had the role of protecting secular Turkish nation state. Next slide, please. During the Republican era, Republican times, during the 20th century, there were 2 coups d'etats, and in each of these coups d'etats, the tutelage system was strengthened. And this system survived up until 2000s. During the tutelage system, several Islamist and Kurdish parties were banned by the Constitutional Court. Next slide, please. In November 2002, Justice and Development Party, in Turkish AKP, came to power. This was a turning point for the tutelage system. In fact, in the initial years of the AKP government, they were not fully in power because of the tutelage system. The civilian and judicial bureaucracy were very powerful, and they were not allowing AKP government to take the control of the country. In order to combat the tutelage system, Justice and Development Party engaged in reforms. They carried out many reforms, democratic reforms, and as a result of these reforms, European Union started accession talks with Turkey in 2005. In 2007, there was presidential election, and AKP government wanted to elect their own member, one of their own member, Abdullah Gül, as the president. But the tutelage system disagreed with this, and they opposed the election of Abdullah Gül as the president because they thought that Abdullah Gül was an Islamist, which is against the Turkish official ideology. But in response to that, AKP government didn't back down, but called for early elections, and they won the early elections, and they were able to elect Abdullah Gül as the new president after the general elections. In 2008, there was a closure case against AKP government, AKP, and the party barely survived the closure case. It was seen in constitutional court, and with a small gap, AKP was able to survive the closure case. Next slide, please. In order to dismantle the tutelage system, AKP government drafted a big amendment program for the constitution. In 2010, this constitutional reform took place. And the structure of High Council of Judges and Prosecutors, along with Constitutional Court and some other changes, were introduced. And this created an opportunity to dismantle the tutelage system, especially with respect to judicial aspects. In the new High Council of Judges and Prosecutors, AKP government went into a coalition with the Gülenists, and they won the elections of 𝐏𝐶𝐜𝐾, which means the High Council of Judges and Prosecutors. But this alliance between the Gülenists and AKP did not last long, and it came to an end in 2013. Next slide, please. In 2014, AKP enters into a new alliance in 𝐏𝐶𝐜𝐾 elections with Eurasianists, nationalists, and some other religious groups. They were able to win the elections of 𝐏𝐶𝐜𝐾. This organization, this council, basically controls the appointments of judges and prosecutors in the country. And in 2016, there was a coup attempt. And after the coup attempt failed, AKP government was able to purge all the alleged Gülenists from the judiciary. Around 5,000 judges and prosecutors were dismissed, were purged from the judiciary. They were accused of being behind the coup attempt by the government. In 2017, there were new constitutional amendments which changed the structure of 𝐏𝐶𝐜𝐾 again. That is, the government was able to control the High Council of Judges and Prosecutors. As a result, they were able to appoint all the judges and prosecutors to new positions. After 2016, we have witnessed 4 law changes in 6 years, with respect to the composition and structure of the high courts, the Court of Cassation and the Council of State. Basically, the government was increasing the numbers of the members first, and then new appointments are made, and then the government reduced the numbers of the members of those courts again. As a result, they were able to purge unwanted members from these high courts. As of today, the Council of Judges and Prosecutors and the high courts are under the control of the executive branch in the country. The judges and prosecutors in Turkey work under an atmosphere of fear. If a judge or a prosecutor file a suit, and open a case or decide on a case which is critical of the government, which is not liked by the government, he or she can be transferred to another city or can be purged even. So this creates an atmosphere of fear among the judges and prosecutors. With respect to rule of law index, Turkey ranks 117th among 142 countries in the year 2023. Today, we cannot talk in Turkey about the existence of rule of law. Unfortunately, the rule of law has eroded greatly in the last 10 years. As I tried to explain, it has never been perfect in Turkey. The weakness goes back to the foundation of the republic. However, AKP government, Justice and Development Party, was able to dismantle the tutelage system after a few years in power. But rather than establishing rule of law and consolidating it in Turkey, they captured the judicial system on their own hand. And today, Turkey is considered to be an illiberal democracy rather than a liberal democracy because of the lack of rule of law in general. This is the end of my presentation for now.
Thank you so much, Prof. Bijan, for your presentation. It was very educational for those of us who are still learning about the situation in Turkey. Next, I would like to introduce Prof. Shad Salim Faruqi. Our next speaker is actually a legal luminary whose contributions to constitutional law and legal scholarship are well recognized both in Malaysia and internationally. Prof. Emeritus Haji Dr. Shad Salim Faruqi is a distinguished Malaysian legal scholar and currently holds the Tunku Abdul Rahman Chair as Professor of Constitutional Law at the University of Malaya. Professor Faruqi has authored 10 influential books, including Islam, International Law, and the War Against Terrorism, published in 2006. His expertise has been sought for prestigious international assignments, such as drafting the Constitution for the Republic of Maldives in the 1990s and developing an NGO proposal for a UN law on the protection of places of worship. His profound insights into constitutional law and governance make him a key contributor to our discussion on liberal democracy. Now I will share the slides and over to you, Prof.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullah. Dr. Ali Salman, Dr. Sahin, Noor, Natusha, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to be with you all. So I must confess that the topic is so large that I don't know how to put the ocean into a bottle. Nevertheless, I'll try. I'm going to concentrate on democracy and human rights, expanding horizons, and emerging challenges in Malaysia. Let me begin by saying that it's not very reliable to measure the depth of the sea at low tide. I believe that the world today is at low tide in the area of democracy and human rights. So I am hopeful and in prayer that this low tide will end. But nevertheless, at this moment, things are not so good. In the matter of democracy, human rights, the rule of law, and good governance, international observers have reported that global freedom declined for the 18th consecutive year in 2023. And Noor, could you give me the next slide, slide 2? Yes, I think that's the report. 18th consecutive year in 2023, the global freedom declined in international assessment. Many self-styled democracies of the West are actively involved in supporting wars of aggression, genocide, crimes against humanity, violations of international humanitarian law, and they are also resorting to trade wars against anyone who does not kowtow to their policies. It's really quite incredible how some of these European and American democracies preach human rights at home, but practice brutalization and dehumanization abroad on the so-called lesser people of the rest of the world. May I go to slide number 4? However, I will not dwell on this worldwide decline of democracy and the rule of law. Instead, I will focus on factors that can reverse this metamorphosis and guide us to the shared path of economic, political, and social flourishing. I will look primarily at the Malaysian context. Slide number 5. Peace and stability. I believe that this is the most fundamental requirement for rule of law and democracy. Life, liberty, and property cannot be protected. Human dignity cannot be promoted. Security of expectations cannot be guaranteed unless the conditions that promote wars, racial or religious riots, and internecine conflicts are removed. A further factor is the high rate of street crime. It is a failed state, in my view, if people cannot live without fear in their neighborhoods. I take note, for example, gun-related violence kills over 35,000 people per year in the land of liberty, that is the USA. Now, next slide, number 6. On this score of peace, security, harmony, Malaysia has done well. The communist insurgency in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s was overcome not only through arms, but by winning over hearts and minds. And I'm happy to report that within Malaysia today, no race, no religion, no region is at war with the central government. Racial, religious, and regional conflicts were largely contained by a unique power-sharing formula and a moderateness of spirit on cultural and religious issues that in many other societies have left a heritage of violence and bitterness. The economy was used to give everyone a stake in the country. And this is actually something I'm quoting to you from the Vice President of Bosnia. During one of the visits, he said this. He said, I congratulate Malaysia that it has used the economy to unite the people. The leaders of Malaysia's independence in 1957 settled for the approach of a mosaic. The various communities were allowed to maintain their distinct ethnic identities, cultures, religions, languages, names, lifestyles, dresses, foods, music, vernacular schools, etc. Political parties and businesses and cultural associations were allowed to be organized on ethnic lines. I don't want to name names, but there are societies within our region where you can't have your own ethnic names. You have to adopt national names. But in Malaysia, that's not so. We are allowed to maintain our cultural names, cultural practices. Protection of human rights. Human rights are not only about personal liberty or speech and assembly, etc., the civil and political rights. I think fulfillment of socio-economic needs is a very important part of human rights. May I say this, that food is as important as freedom and bread is as important as the ballot box. I do not wish to be misunderstood. I'm not talking of prioritization. I'm not saying food must come first and then only freedom. No, I think they must go hand in hand. But what is important is to realize that in lands where there is massive poverty, basic needs have to be met. Otherwise, the rights in the Constitution have no meaning whatsoever. Avoiding famines, preventing malnutrition, ensuring an abundant supply of essential commodities, controlling prices of basic goods and services, including the health service, are essential for the achievement of the socio-economic necessities of life. Next slide. In Malaysia, 6.5 decades of fairly enlightened economic policies have tackled poverty successfully. Till lately, the country used to offer unbelievable opportunities for upward economic, educational, and professional mobility. Next slide, 18. However, in the area of political and civil rights, the balance of power is and always was widely in favor of the state. I'm sorry to report to you that the communist insurgency led to a declaration of emergency. The emergency declared in 1960 was briefly lifted for a few years. Then from 1964 to 2011, 47 years, we were under a state of emergency, during which, of course, the parliament and the executive have virtually unlimited powers. So the balance of power was always in favor of the state. The rights of the Aborigines, many predatory development policies and laws wantonly disregard the rights of communities that depend on nature for sustenance. Minority rights in the arena of politics and enduring democracy must support majority rule, but with minority rights. And Professor Sahin had emphasized this point. Now, in Malaysia, the constitution and the laws in 57 and 1963, when Sabah Sarawak and Singapore, though Singapore later on left, when Sabah Sarawak joined Malaya to constitute Malaysia, I think the constitution provided for minority rights. However, gaps have developed between theory and reality, and the situation must continually be examined to strengthen the substantive dimension of just and fair rules, respect for human rights, a fair and just electoral process, a free and fair media, participatory processes, and inexpensive, informal, and expeditious remedies for infringement of rights. Next slide, 20. Electoral process. We do have elections, but it is not enough that elections are held periodically. In the post-election period, citizens should have a participatory role in consultative processes, referendums, lawmaking through private bills, and the procedures of initiative and recall. And I'm sad to report that that is not so. Next one, sustainable development. Nothing is limitless, and it would be part of good governance to nourish and sustain the cycles of life and to give back to nature what we got from it. At the economic front, there should be a just savings principle to require mandatory preservation of certain amount of capital accumulation for the future. This would also help to protect intergenerational justice and the rights of future generations. I believe that decent people should not only be concerned about their rights, but the rights of their children and children's children. Next slide, 22. Openness and transparency would curb corruption and misuse of power, legitimize the decision-making process, and promote efficiency. I think we must remember that decisions in which people participate are decisions they are likely to respect. I'm afraid that as a society, we suffer from what we jokingly call the Sulit syndrome. Natusha may translate that for me. the official secret syndrome. Everything is chopped with the word secret, official secrets. Even a highway contract is chopped with the words official secret as to what are the terms of the highway contract between the concessionaire and the government of the day. Next slide, please. Controlling corruption. In every society, a large percentage of national expenditure is swallowed up by corrupt practices. A serious culture of corruption has sadly become entrenched in Malaysian society. What is even more disappointing is that some of the corrupt are deified and not demonized. Malaysia's economic success would be strengthened if an impartial and efficient system of investigation and prosecution of corruption through a constitutionally protected integrity commission can be put in place. We do have an anti-corruption commission, but it does not have a constitutional basis. Its chief is basically appointed by the executive. There is an absence of an independent ombudsman or the muhtasib in Islamic law. There is lack of freedom of information. There are weak provisions of a Whistleblowers Act. And there is the all-embracing provision of the Official Secrets Act. There are no elections for local authorities. And all this does not gel with the ideal of a government that is responsible to the people and responsive to the felt necessities of the time. However, one positive aspect is that there is a partnership between public and private sectors. The government has successfully harnessed the powers of the private sector, has encouraged private enterprise since independence. People have been allowed to soar to the heights they wish to reach. This use of the economy to give people a stake in the country did much to bring development as well as to promote unity. We need to strengthen checks and balances. The desirability of a strong and determined government clashes with the need to tame naked power and to make it conform to the rule of law. A mature democracy must control the government without crippling it. The balance between the might of the state and the rights of the citizens can be achieved by a host of institutions, principles, and procedures like the following. Next one, a judiciary with the power of judicial review. We have that. The Constitution gives to the judiciary a fair amount of independence. Sadly, institutions are as good as the people who administer them. We suffered decades of a judicial winter, but I'm happy to report that the Malaysian judiciary is now in a renaissance. It so happens, and Nur Natusha will be happy to, of course, take note of that. It so happens, for the first time in our history, there is a lady Chief Justice, and the courts are doing wonderfully well. In many democracies, including Malaysia, Parliament is elected, but not representative. The British simple plurality system, which we borrowed, in many areas, we are more British than the British. And this is one of them. We adopted this British simple plurality system, and it results in massive disparity between the percentage of popular votes and the percentage of seats won. A government can have 92% of seats in the lower house with 60% of the popular vote. Electoral reform is needed, but faces massive political hurdle because, of course, it would take away the unfair advantage that the electoral system gives to the government of the day. Now, despite the so-called system of responsible government, the political executive is hardly answerable to the legislature. In fact, the executive has captured Parliament. In the legislative process, Parliament legitimates. It does not legislate. Next slide. There is no independent ombudsman system. And intermediaries like the Auditor General, Election Commission, Human Rights Commission, Anti-Corruption Commission exist, but their independence is not guaranteed. Some developments like a whistleblower's law a decade ago and the appointment of a Judicial Appointments Commission, however, hold some promise. There are other issues. I'm now, Dr. Ali Salman, I'm coming towards the end of my essay now. There are other issues. Malaysia has a serious problem of endemic corruption and the looting of public funds by some of those in power. The economy is in serious decline, so this is also partly because of the COVID-19 crisis. Inter-ethnic and inter-religious relations, which were actually a matter of pride for Malaysia for many, many decades, but they are now frayed. The policies of Islamization and the discussion of the Islamic State and the strong attacks on secularism, pluralism, and liberalism are polarizing society. Dr. Salman, your topic was about liberal democracy. I deliberately left out the word liberal because if I use liberal democracy, nobody will read my essay. So liberalism is a dirty word in Malaysia. It's not what Professor Sahin had beautifully described. But in Malaysia, liberalism has acquired very negative connotations. So the dominant narrative is that secularism, pluralism, liberalism are evil, and this is polarizing society because the Islamic movement is actually quite against secularism, pluralism, and liberalism, and I don't understand that. Sharia and civil court disputes abound, and not just the ordinary population. The judiciary is deeply divided on how these disputes must be resolved. Education system has deteriorated because the education system has, to some extent, become largely Islamicized, in the sense that there's a lot of emphasis on form, not so much on substance. The privatization of many essential services is hurting the poor. Next slide. Though more and more human rights are being asserted, counter tides are also visible everywhere. For example, the age of terrorism requires massive restraint on personal liberty. Malaysia has done well to control terrorism, but at the cost of personal liberties. The marvels of technology and the rise of social media have made it impossible to suppress free speech. At the same time, the dilemma is how to balance freedom with responsibility. Abuse of free speech through fake news is widespread. And I know that some of you may not like what I say, but to me, freedom per se has no value. It's what freedom is for. It's the use to which it is put. It's the sense of responsibility and restraint with which it is exercised. Then, due to intrusive technology, our right to privacy is disappearing. Next slide. The era of human rights is creating a deluge of human rights claims. Please forgive me, this is very controversial. It is being asserted that homosexuality, same-sex marriages, abortion, euthanasia, cross-dressing, attempted suicide, drug taking are all part of personal autonomy. COVID vaccination was resisted by some on the ground of personal autonomy. I've had students in my class, Prof. Sahin, who ask me, they have a fundamental right to smoke. And I tell them, oh yes, you may have a right to smoke, but please inhale, do not exhale. Of course, they don't agree with me. They feel smoking and all these things are fundamental rights. Pornography and blasphemy, part of free speech. Do cigarette smokers have a right to smoke? So due to this deluge of human rights claims, some authors are asserting that not all rights are human rights. There is a need to distinguish between human rights and ordinary civil and political claims. Next one, next slide, 42. Due to the spread of capitalism, globalization, and internationalization, Asia and Africa's indigenous resources and inventions are being expropriated by powerful multinationals. I'm sure you'll agree with me. Human rights violations not only come within the state, they can come from across the borders. Workers are being displaced by machines, digital processes, artificial intelligence. In some, the horizons of human rights are expanding in some areas, constricting in others. In the last few years, some positive developments on the human rights scene have taken place. Emergency under Article 150 was lifted in 2011 after 47 years. The voting age was reduced from 21 to 18. And I'm happy to report, though some of you may be skeptical about it, even an MP can get elected at age 18 now. An 18-year-old can become an MP or a state assemblyman in our parliament and state assemblies. There is automatic registration of voters, which in one stroke empowered millions of people who do not wish to register or who did not register. Mandatory death penalty has been abolished. Judges have a discretion. Sexual offenses against children law was strengthened. Suicide has been decriminalized. Citizenship rights of children born abroad are being amended to remove discrimination against mothers. The Malaysian Constitution in 1957 was in many areas gender biased. So if a child was born abroad, the child would get citizenship from the father. Even if the mother was a Malaysian national, the mother doesn't matter. But that is being amended now. Suhakam, our Human Rights Commission, has been strengthened. A child's commissioner has been appointed to take hold of children's rights. Next one. But serious concerns have developed in some areas. Genocide in Gaza shows that the international law on human rights is in tatters. The hypocrisy of international human rights is exposed, and the so-called universality of human rights is a shameless lie. I want to confess to you that last December, I was invited by a European Union organization to speak about universal human rights. And I said, can I instead speak about Eastern reflections and Western perceptions of human rights? And I was told, no, I have to speak on universality of human rights. And I told them then that I will not speak. Just a few days ago, the Geneva Conventions, people were here to ask us to speak. I want to confess to you very frankly, many of us are now reluctant to talk about the international law on human rights and the blatant violations of human rights that are taking place. At home, sadly, we still have some security laws. I won't go into details. These are the names, SOSMA, POTA, POCA. They remain in the book. The promised separation between the Attorney General and the public prosecutor has not been delivered. Court decisions are not often enforced by the police or the administration. Dato Sri Najib's trial and his partial pardon show there is one law for the poor and another for the elites. Frequent custodial deaths are a matter of concern. There have been unresolved, enforced disappearances in the last few years. Very sad, enforced disappearances. Next slide, please. On the border with Thailand, a death camp of migrants was discovered. Till today, no one knows who set up the camp, who were the people, the violators of the rights. Some foreign workers work under slave-like conditions. Corruption in society is endemic. A Malaysian society famous worldwide for its inclusiveness and moderation is lurching more and more towards racist and religious bigotry. Bridges of understanding are being replaced by walls of separation. Society is in general supportive, not supportive of the rights of others. By others, I mean people of other race, religion, etc. This is sad because to me, the first function of freedom should be to free someone else. There are many structural injustices that need to be exposed. So all in all, sorry, last slide. All in all, the cup of liberty is not full to the brim. Is it half full or is it half empty? I think that's a matter of opinion. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah.
Thank you so much, Prof. Shad, for your illumination on such a complex topic. We appreciate so much how you've also given a lot of context for not just Malaysians to recap on how we're progressing on liberty, but also for others who are not from Malaysia to also understand the context and mapping it in a global perspective. So I'm very pleased now to begin the Q&A session. We are still on time, so if you've not put in your questions, there is a Q&A section for participants where you can insert your questions, and inshallah we'll get to it, and our distinguished speakers will be able to address them. So please do not hesitate to ask questions.
Yeah, thank you. I think wonderful presentations by our learned speakers. I really enjoyed both the Professor Bijan and Professor Shad's presentations. They touched upon a number of crucial issues which we face today as citizens of our countries, but also citizens like global citizens. And I will raise a few points for their consideration, and then maybe Professor Bijan and Professor Shad can respond to those points or questions while we wait for any comments from the audience. First of all, I think one of my takeaways is that it is interesting that both Turkey and Malaysia are, in terms of functionality, they are democratic countries. No one can deny that political change is possible through democratic means, through electoral means. And there is also an element of political competition in both countries. There have been changes, most recently in Turkey, in local elections. I think people voted for change, and there is a path that people are looking for a change in broader political sense. Also in Malaysia, despite the very long rule of UMNO, there was a big change in 2018 under complex political arrangement, and since then Malaysia has seen many, and more prime minister than it has in last few decades. But I think it's a part of the democratic evolution. But as we note that there are competitive political parties in Malaysia, so both countries are very functional in terms of democracy. But as our learned speakers have highlighted, that there are limitations to the democracy. We learned from both presentations that there is an issue of institutional capture, if I can use this word, control of judiciary in Turkey, and how it has influenced the political outcomes in the past. Also, the role of the deep state, the military, has been there in case of Turkey history. And in Malaysia, we learned that despite the democratic development, the institutional capture, the issues of corruption are very dominant, and they affect the quality of the development outcome also. And I also learned that perhaps a takeaway is that while both countries are democratic, state is still dominating over individual rights. This was made explicit in Professor Shad's presentation, but also I think implied in Bijan's presentation. Maybe they can dwell more on that. I will leave these two questions. One is that, Professor Shad, this is for you, because you have also worked a lot on international law. And I know you briefly mentioned in the end about the current situation and the relevance of or irrelevance of international legal system in many regimes in the world, including Gaza, but also other countries where human rights have been violated, and we have seen the limitations of international system, including the court system, international court system, the UN system. And how would you like to, address as a solution going forward? And a question for Bijan, but also for Professor Shad. Both of you mentioned about the role of Islam in the political systems, more so in case of Malaysia, but also I think the rise of AKP, an association AKP with political Islam, has been looked with some suspicion in the secularists. And similarly, Professor Shad mentioned that the rise of Islamism in the democratic systems, or in, let's say, in the political system, has caused challenges for liberal individual rights, and that Professor Shad is concerned about that. So maybe some further comments and explanation would be in order. Who would like to begin? Professor Shad, maybe you would like to begin, or Bijan?
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Ali Salman. I will take up this first point about international law and our despondency at the way international law is showing inability to tackle brutalities, dehumanization of entire populations. You're entirely right. It's not just Gaza. Actually, it's so many other areas of inhumanity. What's happening in Myanmar, for example, then of course in Ukraine, in many other parts of Africa, Latin America. International law is unable to tackle these issues, and I do not know if there is any simple solution, but I do know this, that the United Nations needs to be reformed. Security Council is basically an institution captured by the victors of World War II. So even if sometimes there is near unanimity, one nation can veto the resolution. So I think the power must shift from the Security Council to the General Assembly. That would be more democratic. So I think the nations of Asia, Africa, Latin America must keep on asserting themselves on this issue of reform of the United Nations, reform of international law. But I don't see this happening easily, because the structural issues are involved. I have to say this with sadness, that war is war, sale of weapons. These are economically very beneficial. War is very beneficial to some, the arms manufacturers, the armed forces. So these things will not go away easily, but nevertheless, we have to talk. In my lifetime, I have seen, of course, apartheid fall in South Africa. In my lifetime, I saw many Asian nations, at least nominally, gaining freedom. Politically, they gain freedom, though not economically. So I think progress can be achieved, but we have to stand up. We have to stand up and talk. We have to take risks. We need leadership. And sadly, in much of Asia and Africa, leadership is lacking, partly because leaders have been bought. I'm told many of the leaders in Middle East, in Islamic Middle East, have been bought over. So I think there is hope for reform, but reform will require us to make sacrifices. When it comes to the second question, the role of Islam, what does Islam really mean? That's a big question. Is it form or is it substance? What's the real message of Islam? There's no unanimity on that. But what I will say is this, Dr. Ali Salman, in Malaysia, from 1957 independence to about 1980, Islam had a very important position in our legal system. At the same time, Islam that was practiced was tolerant, was inclusive, and it did not contain many of the problems that we are facing today. In other words, we do have a historical record of giving to Islam a very prominent position in our legal, political system, at the same time actually living together in peace and harmony with various Muslim sects as well as with non-Muslims. So I would humbly recommend that what we need to do is, what Malaysians need to do is to look back to our history, to look back to the period of intercommunal harmony, to the period of moderation, to the period of give and take, whereby actually Islam was regarded as an issue of faith rather than a means for securing political power. Now the emphasis basically is on securing political power. So I don't have any simple solutions, but I would just recommend that actually Malays, Muslims look back to our history, and I think Malaysia was an exemplar for many other Muslim nations as to how a Muslim society could be so multicultural, could be so harmonious.
Thank you, Professor Shad. Dr. Bijan, would you like to share your thoughts?
Thank you, Ali. With respect to Turkish experience, I can say that in the first 10 years of its administration, Justice and Development Party, AKP government, has been quite reformist. Previously, as I explained, there were limitations on limitations on religious freedoms. For example, a woman couldn't wear headscarf on the public sphere. They couldn't attend university, for example. This was problematic. And thanks to the reforms AKP government carried out, this ban was abolished. Now it is free in Turkey to attend a university and also a public office with a woman with a headscarf. These were all positive developments. However, in the second half of their government, I observed that they try to Islamize the country in general, Islamicize the country in general. They are doing this through, for example, education. They are opening religious schools rather than secular schools. They are converting secular schools into religious schools. They are forcing individuals to attend religious schools. They have not been imposing like headscarves or other things so far. But as I said, they try to make the society, the culture more religious. This is problematic from a liberal democratic perspective. In a liberal democratic state, ideally speaking, the state should be neutral towards citizens. The state should provide the freedoms, including the religious freedoms. Individuals should be able to experience their religion as they wish. But the state shouldn't try to promote religion. This is what AKP government is doing currently. They are trying to promote religion through public fundings and at the expense of secular institutions. This is problematic, in my view.
Thank you, Dr. Bijan. Now, I see that there are a number of questions which our audience and participants have posed. We will try to do justice by addressing those questions and referring to the speakers. I'm going to open the Q&A box. So this is the question from Edu Omershevich, one of our founding members, actually. He asked, this is a question, I think, responding to Professor Shad. Can we get some practical examples of differences between universal and Eastern human rights? And how do we justify the difference from the Eastern philosophical perspective? I think this is a response to one of your last comments, Professor Shad. Would you like to address that? And since there are about 10 questions, I will request the speakers to answer them briefly. Thank you.
It's quite easy actually to point out difference between universal and Eastern. For example, our concept of family is so different from, let us say, the concept of family in the United States. Maybe I didn't travel wide enough, but to me, the concept of family in the USA is rather narrow. But to me, my brothers, my sisters, my parents, they're all my family. In Singapore, Prof. Ali, in Singapore in 1995, they passed a law to say children have a duty to support their parents above 60 years of age. Now, if such a law were passed in the United States, they would say, are you joking? So I think there's certainly a feeling, for example, in Islam, in the law of inheritance, you can't shut out your parents, your wife, your children. You can't shut out. I know this would look like a violation of human rights, but the other side of the story is that you can't just shut out your family by virtue of the fact that they were born into your clan. They have some rights. The second example, the importance of religion. I know Professor Sahin did mention this, that the state should not be involved in religion, but actually in many Asian societies, Malaysia is one of them, certainly Muslim society here, the idea that the state should not be involved in religion will not be acceptable to most Muslims. If the state can be involved in health, if the state can be involved in education, if the state can be involved in development, why should it not be involved in promoting religion? But of course, in a tolerant way. So this idea that rights are only universal and there is no concept of Eastern rights, this is racism. This is a belief that only you and you can have a concept of human rights and I cannot have one. But actually in many areas, for example, to us, blasphemy, to me, blasphemy is a crime. To you, it may be freedom of speech. But I think leave my religion alone and I will leave your religion alone in terms of insulting. By all means, praise your religion sky high, but don't insult other religions. So I think whether it's blasphemy, whether it is the concept of family, whether it is issues like personal autonomy rights, I think there are differences of opinion. And Dr. Salman, in my own house, at the dining table, my wife and children don't agree with me on some issues. Oh, come on. So now that's their right. Now, don't tell me then that the whole world is one community and therefore there is no difference of opinion possible. This is totally rejected by the Volksgeist theory of historical school, that actually law is basically a reflection of the will of the people. So I can't understand these double standards here, that on the one hand, individuals have individualism. They have their own value system. On the other hand, the whole world must agree on basically what Western society says. Dr. Ali, many of the international documents were basically drafted by Western victors of World War II, with very little participation from Eastern societies. Very little. You look at the composition of the United Nations Security Council. So I think this is an incredible idea that Eastern and Western, Eastern perceptions and Western reflections are the same in matters of human rights. Not at all. We have differences. But there is, sorry, may I just add one line, sir? At the core, there is some paradigm of commonalities. But at the penumbra, at the fringes, you've got to accept that there are differences. Otherwise, that is racism.
Thank you so much for a very elaborate answer. I will refer now to Professor Bijan. And this is a question asked by Dr. Muhammad Khalid Masood, who himself is a very noted scholar. Thank you both for very honest and frank critical views of liberty and democracy in Turkey and Malaysia. this critical view applies to the Muslim as well as Western countries. My question is Dr. Khalid asking, is this decline has been caused by overemphasis on sovereignty and authority versus citizens and minorities? I think, Dr. Bijan, you did address that question. Would you like to respond to that?
Yes, thank you. I think there has been a drift towards the overemphasis as the speaker, as the person who asked the question emphasized. There has been a drift towards the emphasis of over sovereignty and overemphasis of authority vis-a-vis the individual rights. And this has been a mistake. In my view, it should be quite the opposite way. That is, the emphasis should be over the individual rights. The authority should be present for the preservation of the individual rights and liberties, rather than the other way around. Many times, individuals are sacrificed for the state, for the society, for the authority. I think this has been a wrong policy, and it should be reversed. And this is what we are trying to do through civil society activities such as this.
Thank you. Now, this is a question which maybe have been addressed in parts already. The Turkish constitution declared Turkey as a secular country. What does the Malaysian constitution declare about the state religion? And how does it play out in terms of democratic processes in both Turkey and Malaysia? If you can both answer that to clarify this point briefly.
I'll do it very briefly, sir. The Malaysian constitution neither declares Malaysia an Islamic state, nor does it anyway use the word secularism. Basically, we are somewhere in between. I know some people will say things should be black or things should be white, but I don't agree with that at all. Article 3 of the Federal Constitution declares Islam to be the religion of the Federation. At the same time, Article 4 says this Constitution is the supreme law of the Federation. So actually, we are somewhere in between. Islam does apply, but Dr. Ali, only in about 25 topics of Muslim personal family law. In other areas, crime, tort, contract, banking, commercial law, basically the laws are laws made by the parliament or the state assemblies. So Malaysia is a hybrid state, and I have no apologies about that.
Thank you for a very clear and precise answer. Dr. Bijan?
In the case of Turkey, I think it's a good thing that the constitution states that it's a secular state. However, the practice has not been freedom-friendly. That is, the tradition has been in the French-style laïcité, which means the control of the religion by the state. In the past, the religion has been controlled by the state. It has been tried to be curtailed in the civil society. But the real secularism should be based on the freedom of conscience and religion. The state should be secular and should provide freedom of conscience and religion to its members, to the citizens, to individuals. It has been, as I said, in the past, on the opposite direction. I hope that in the future, it will become a real secular, freedom-friendly secular state.
Thank you. Dr. Bijan, a follow-up question with you, to you by Edu. And since you talked extensively about rule of law, question is the lack of rule of law part of instability in Turkey? And in the West, the appearance of the COVID situation also resulted in the erosion of human rights. Thus, might we say that it is general social instability that results in the erosion of the rule of law and human rights in an attempt to enforce stability in society?
I didn't quite get the last part of the question.
The question is whether the erosion of rule of law, which you mentioned in the case of Turkey, is a result of, is an effort to enforce stability in society.
I don't think it's a result of the enforcement of stability in the society. Quite opposite. I think it is the result of the trial of capturing the state rather than trying to establish stability in the society. Justice and Development Party demolished the tutelage system, which was the right thing, but established its own hegemony over the judiciary. I think this is the reason of lack of rule of law in Turkey. The purpose has been to capture the state and use it for partisan purposes.
Thank you. A question about on the economy actually here by Mustafa Raji, our friend from Algeria. What is the role of distributive economic state impact in the democratic experience in both countries? And I think that when the state have more resources, state can give a few powers to the people. If I understand this question, I think the question is about the economic inequality in both countries vis-a-vis democratic development, whether democratic development have helped in economic redistribution or not quite. Any comments would be helpful.
It is expected that as the country develops economically, in a democratic society especially, the resources should be distributed among the citizens broadly. Of course, the wealth generating system is the market mechanism. Market economy is the source of the wealth in the country. And in democratic countries, governments are more receptive towards the demands coming from the people. And it is expected that resources will be distributed more evenly. However, this has not been the case up until now. And currently, Turkey is going through an economic crisis. The lower segments of the society are suffering greatly. This is what I can say for the moment.
Thank you. Professor Shad, would you like to address this question?
Yes, Dr. Ali. I am sad to report that as far as the Constitution of Malaysia is concerned, the Constitution does not anywhere mention what could be called socio-economic rights. Based on a Western model, our Constitution primarily emphasizes civil and political rights, but the right to water, electricity, housing, roads, medical benefit, what could be called socio-economic rights are not mentioned. Nevertheless, in the last 66 years, economic policies to assist the lower sections of society, the poorer section of society have definitely been part of government policy. But I have to say something that I'm increasingly growing to believe, and it is a sad belief, and that is this. I'm not so sure, Dr. Ali, whether the democratic system of government is suitable for structural changes in matters of solving problems of poverty. Democracy is good for incremental changes, but whether democracy can bring about radical, structural, systemic changes, I'm not so sure. A good example would be a country like India, touted as the largest democracy of the world in terms of numbers. Poverty is still very widespread, though I know India is making great progress, but there is massive disparity. The same situation is in Malaysia. Despite FELDA schemes, land clearance schemes to give land to the poor, subsidies, low-cost housing, price controls. Despite that, there are massive disparities, and these disparities are increasing. Because I think one thing democracy and democratic freedoms allow is that they allow the deep state to capture power. Not only it's able to buy votes it is able to buy lobbyists, MPs, ministers, become not representative of the people, but become representative of the lobbies. So I'm a little bit sad to say that my feeling is that when it comes to poverty eradication, equality in terms of socio-economic justice, democracy is not the best system in the world. Though if you ask me what else, I need more time.
And maybe we can have another webinar on that in the future.
Sure.
But thank you for that. I will probably mention a couple of questions in one go, because I think they are similar, and this is Professor Bijan. Noor Huda Ramli and also Fidaur Rahman. They asked this question about, is there any counter movement against state Islamist cultural hegemony? This is a question, and how big is the movement, if there is any movement? And Fidaur Rahman asked this question, in the face of unlimited political power being enforced to curtail the power of tutelage system, what is the response of society or civil society? How would you like to respond to this question, Bijan?
It is quite complicated. In the case of Turkey, in the civil society, there has been reaction to Islamization of the society in general. There are civil society organizations and also political parties are opposing the movement towards Islamization of society, I would say. But civil society, unfortunately, not quite strong in Turkey. The movement has been not so strong in the case of Turkey. Rather, political parties have been quite vocal against the Islamicization. Second question, I didn't understand.
About the tutelage system. Similar question, I think, but whether civil society has been able to curtail these powers.
As I said, civil society has not been quite strong, unfortunately. There are voices in the civil society, like LGBT organizations, for example, have been quite vocal, and some other organizations, human rights organizations, but their numbers and influence are limited.
The last question is by Abdur Rauf. And this is a particular question: when the Islamists are in power, they have a say in political authority, how do they then respond to the notion of liberal democracy and human rights? So once through democracy, they are in power, but then how would they take these two concepts, human rights and liberal democracy? Either Professor Shad or Professor Bijan.
Dr. Ali, in Malaysia, we don't really have an example of Islamic groups seizing a monopoly of political power at the federal level, but we have some states, for example, the state of Kelantan, Terengganu, on the East Coast, where Islamic political parties have been in power for most of the independence. Depending on the leadership, there has been tolerance of other groups. There has been large-heartedness towards the minorities rather than an oppression of them, depending on the leadership. But in terms of economic development, I'm afraid the states where the Islamists are in power have made absolutely no progress. But the irony is this, that they are able to nevertheless capture and recapture political support, because they blame it all, not blame it, they rest it all on the will of God. Inshallah, things will happen. Now, see, if God doesn't have the insha, which it's not the fault of the leaders, but if you vote for me, you go to heaven. Now, that is very, very attractive to many of these groups. And I'm sorry to report that a large number of people believe in that. If I'm a Muslim, I have a duty to support this party because that is my passport to heaven. So economically, they haven't succeeded. Politically, there has been authoritarian policies or open policies depending on the leaders in power. And I think everywhere in the world, leaders can make a difference. Leaders of substance do not follow opinion polls. They mold opinion, not with guns or dollars of position, but with the power of their souls. I think Jesse Jackson said that. So I think that is so also in some of the Muslim states on the East Coast in Malaysia. Thank you.
Yes, please, Bijan.
In the case of Turkey, Islamists have been, in the past, have been subjected to injustices, and they have been quite vocal about their rights and defending liberal democracy while they were in the opposition, while they were not in the power positions. However, after they came to power, they changed their discourse. Unfortunately, they forgot the human rights defense, and also liberal democracy is not seen by them as in a positive way any longer.
Thank you, Bijan. Thank you, Professor Shad. I think the time is running out for this very interesting webinar. I've tried to take as many questions as the time allows, and there were some comments which I think have been shared by with the speakers. There are suggestions for future webinars comparing Turkey and Pakistan, which I will leave to a future discussion, and we'll do it perhaps one day. But I would like to thank both Professor Bijan and Professor Shad for very intellectually engaging and stimulating discussion on complex topic of liberal democracy and human rights and its implications for governance, implications for international law, implications for economic development. I think there are some issues which remain unresolved, but we will leave it for another day. And I would like to particularly mention the tension on the idea of human rights or individual rights. Do we have a universally agreed definition on what are the individual rights, and at what point do we determine that the exercise of individual rights erode the other rights, the other's person rights? And I'll take the example of Professor Shad about smoking. Right, you can inhale but not exhale. I think this is an excellent manifestation of the limitation of individual rights, where you should not exercise the coercion on other side. And this is what Bijan also mentioned about the idea of negative liberty. So there are I think these helpful conceptual framework. But I conclude the webinar here, and I thank again both our learned speakers, and I hand over back to our MC Noor Natasha.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. First and foremost, let's just say thank you so much to our distinguished speakers and to Dr. Ali for moderating such a amazing discussion that unfortunately has to come to an end. But inshallah, we'll continue as this is the Edraak webinar series by Islam and Liberty Network. If you like further updates of our upcoming events, please follow us on our social media. We have Facebook, Instagram, as well as LinkedIn. You can also follow our newsletter, which is on MailChimp, where you'll get right up-to-date and advanced updates about our future events and other interesting things.
Just a quick thing that we also publish the videos on our YouTube channel. So we will publish the webinar also on the YouTube for those who have not been able to attend. There were many more registrations. But I think today we had still a good participation and very engaged audience. But we will publish on YouTube for wider dissemination.
And there'll also be a podcast version of the webinar available, so you can listen to it during your drive or while you're working, inshallah. That is the end of today's session. Thank you very much for your time and energy, everyone, and see you soon.